It's a big day. It's been about, I don't know, 2 months since we procured and went through this engine. All the suspension's ready. Well, I say it's ready. This thing went way too low whenever I put it on the ground, so we're gonna have to put a bunch more into these front coils. But other than that, I have ran the wiring. The PCM is mounted under the dash and everything's ready to go there. Got the rear main and then the rear main cover seal to change out because I had it on this engine stand when I did the rest of the work. Intake's just sitting on here. We'll lift it off, bolt up the transmission and all that goodness. Hopefully our Speed Engineering transmission mount sits real nice and happy back there. And we can start plumbing and wiring. I've got it on the hoist off the stand and flex plate removed. It looks like someone did a little creative sealant on here. We probably had a leak at one time. They actually put sealant out here too. So probably a good thing we removed that to take care of this now. Sorry I didn't even think to have time to set the camera up. Knocked the old sealed out. This new one literally just pressed in by hand. There was no resistance whatsoever. I could probably just pull it out by hand. But I just don't really want to put RTV on the back side of it. I think that just introduces more things in the clearance that you're not supposed to have. I do know, because I have seen on these LS motors, when people put a little silicone in the corners like you used to do in small block Chevy, both on the front timing cover plate and this rear plate, it literally just squishes all of it out and is completely clear of any residue because the way these gaskets work so well. It's a total waste of time. But you can put it on there if it just makes you feel better, I suppose. Gone around and just kind of hit this with a gray Scotch-Brite pad just to sort of start a new sealing surface against the seal. And then I'll make sure we've cleaned up this surface as well. Hey, I remember that guy. Like a square peg in a round hole, which setting these things in is not always that easy. You got a lot of moving parts, or I guess different bracketry and stuff that all have to line up perfect. And it took a lot of using a punch and a wedge and some vice grips to clamp that down to get both motor mounts started. The AC is definitely not going to work down here. Not so much because of the frame contact, but it's making contact on the sway bar, which I could tolerance that or clearance that, I guess. It's making a little contact here on this power steering line, which I could clearance that. The biggest problem is the compressor hits right here on this engine mount. And even if I tried to move the engine forward a little bit, which would probably make it work like that, we're still gonna have a lot of issues with more things coming into contact with the sway bar the further this engine comes forward. So we'll just have to go with the big high mount. This was the side that kind of concerned me the most with the steering shaft that we had to make to go with this power steering rack. My harness is all kind of wadded up in this trash bag to protect it because I wanted it fed through the firewall before the engine was in the way. So now, probably bolt the starter on and start adjusting the lines to the, the battery lines that actually tie to the starter. Then you run from the starter to the battery. That kind of needs to happen before I get the header on. And then the rest of the actual engine management harness will start happening as well. It's gonna be difficult to try to film this, so I'll probably just kind of keep track in stages. Here's progress for today. Got the starter in there. This cable ran. This is actually like sleeve that you put over spark plug wires, and I bought like 10 foot of it because I figured that would be good to have near these headers. And then there's a starter cover from DEI, which this will bolt up in place. And all that clears. Coolant temp sensor for my gauge kit. The harness is all ran. Intake is installed. I do have this header on like you guys saw before. This is the oil pressure sender that came with the gauge kit. And then this is my wire to go to the alternator that'll connect down to the starter. So looks pretty good. I'm not unhappy with it. I wish I would have had the bravery to clean up and cut off a bunch of this stuff off this intake and kind of clean it up, but whatever. I was afraid, sure enough, I'd get to hacking away at it and crack the thing open and then it would just be ruined. Before I get too overzealous in installing all the exhaust and getting the fuel line permanently ran, I want to get this transmission linkage installed between the column and the transmission itself. Now from the factory, this transmission had a cable, but these are kind of nice to run. We think we did the same thing on our other square body build. This is from Summit. It's a Top Street Performance brand, and it works on almost every GM automatic transmission that you could potentially be swapping in a truck like this. So the first thing they want you to do is mount the transmission linkage down there at 8 o'clock position, then install the eyelet up here on your column. Test fit it by threading this on up here. Make sure they're both in park, which is the furthest clockwise position if you're looking at the side of your transmission. Now I've got a Sharpie, and I can kind of mark the length of this guy. We can kind of get an idea of how much to trim off based on where this bracket will lay. I'm gonna say right in here. The collector may get hit. That's a bad angle. All right, we're gonna start from pretty much 9 o'clock position in park. Reverse. All right, done. Before we get too happy with ourselves, test this oxygen sensor. Yeah, we're good. Might as well button this up while we're here. Installed the water pump so I can go ahead and mock up this AC bracket. I'll just leave it there finger tight. Easy to take off if we need to. Also, this is the ICT bracketry that I ordered to mount the power steering pump and the alternator. I couldn't stand the look of that giant cast bracket that comes with these from the factory. And honestly, this bracket was about half as much as the AC bracket from Vintage Air. I tend to make up new words whenever I'm putting these AN fittings on, because that stainless stuff right there will go through you like a hot knife through butter. Got the pressure side done. I just threaded into that. And by the way, I don't think I mentioned it, but that is a reduced orifice to restrict the flow into this Ford rack. Makes a little nice curve there and goes into the pressure side of the rack, which I verified, looked it up, and put a P and pointed towards there so I didn't mess that up halfway through. On the return side, I had to cut that barb off of this return tube into the reservoir and put this 6AN adapter. So I'll run a 90 there and then a 90 here. But my priority was getting this 90 installed for the pressure side, and figured I could work around it for the return. I believe the term is affectionately bada bing. Both of these lines are in there. It wasn't as terrible as I probably whined and cried and made it out to be. There's plenty of flexation. Let's see if I can get this to focus. Yeah, the engine to torque. That thing's got enough room to like collapse that bin, so that's good. This is one of those details not often thought about when you're switching to a drive-by-wire system on an LS swap. This is the pedal that came with the truck, if you will, or with the engine we pulled out. You can tell there's a big offset to the right and it sits up much higher, which if you see it mounted in the truck, it just doesn't work very well. This was from Hawk Motorsports on eBay, and they were great because I did have to reach out to them. There's a pin connection issue this one had. You can maybe see where I had to cut that little rib off. That is not there on the factory one. Also, you have to relocate the brown wire from the E location straight across to the A location, which is not the end of the world to just repin that. And once those are done, this bolts right in the factory location to make it comfortable. It looks factory like the 86 did, and still works with your Gen 3 setup. You know, I almost didn't cover installing this transmission dipstick. Again, it's another eBay item, but honestly, they're all about the same no matter what you pay for them. Just because the description says it fits your transmission, it doesn't mean that it actually is the right length. So if I installed this fully where it's supposed to be, you'll see that hangs down far below where it should. As a matter of fact, it would read full 3/4 of the way up in the transmission pan. You actually want it to be full up kind of towards the mating surface of the pan and the transmission case. So I'm gonna have to cut a full inch out of this cable to make it read accurately for our 4L60E. Last thing we have to do before we can start this engine up is hook up this transmission cooler. So I ordered basically the biggest thing that this Transaver brand makes, and it's good for 22,000 pound GVW. It's the monster. Now, we don't need it. We're not going to do any towing or use for this truck that's going to require it. But my plan is to rear mount it, so I don't want it up in front of the condenser and just generating more heat before my AC and stuff. And we should have no problem with this. A lot of new trucks don't even come with one that goes in front like that. So I know a lot of people will throw a fit, but this will be completely sufficient for this application. We ordered these, which is what took forever. These fittings just go in place the factory transmission cooler fittings, and then convert it to a 6AN, which for those of you who don't know is 3/8 of an inch ID. Then we go 6AN to hose barb, 3/8 transmission line hose. Make sure it is specific because of the temperature range and the pressure, which isn't all that high. I got some hose management here with these little clamps, and then we will wrap both lines together with this thermal shield as it's kind of going over the exhaust system just to keep anything from giving us problems later on. Including what I was able to get in the torque converter, I've put just right at 2 gallons of transmission fluid in here. Once we start the engine, it'll pump more of that from the pan into the torque converter and into the transmission cooler that we mounted, and then we'll have to adjust it. But we can't run it very long, obviously, with no coolant. This is that part when I'm trying to come up with something that I forgot before I go to start this engine, and I'm sure there's going to be something. I will point out on this Speed Engineering exhaust system, I have been on the struggle bus with it, loosening and adjusting and trying everything I can. The X-pipe seems to either want to hit the U-joint or angle the exhaust down way too low, and then we got to go way too high to get back over the 4-link. I've sent them emails, photographs, talked to them on the phone. They just don't seem to have any suggestions besides keep fiddling with it. But for now, I've just snugged up some of the clamps so it doesn't rattle too terribly bad doing this test. Several things we're trying to accomplish here. One, making sure that all of our wiring in the dash for the ECM is working and connected properly. Also, I want to see if our oil pressure gauge that we installed shows up here when the engine starts. By the way, I don't know if I told you guys, I've wired this to ignition positive and then the PCM ground output for check engine. So we're actually going to have a check engine light in a factory 86 C10 location. All right, I'm a little nervous. You guys are with me the first time this happens, and I've got 3 cameras on it. Nothing. I would read drop down to 9 volts when I'd hit the ignition switch. On the output to the crank, let's see what it does. We're hooked up to the old Ford. Nothing. Still 9.76 volts. This is why we test. I've disconnected the cranking wire that comes from the ignition from the starter. So I'm going to test this lead just this side of the firewall. Ignition on. Crank position 13.1. Now I did tap the starter with the lead mallet to see if it was hung up, drawing amperage. Be my luck it'll crank this time, but we're at least going to measure voltage output on the crank wire. Yep. So probably had a hung up starter. All right, let's kick the tires and light the fires. Oil pressure, good. Check engine light, bad. See if the throttle works. It does. That's enough. I'm going to call that a successful enough test that we can put all the ductwork and the vintage air together and put the dash in this bad boy. Yeah, I don't think it's supposed to sound like that. We're gonna go get that changed out, probably go ahead and buy our Optima battery, finish that exhaust, and the truck sits on the ground. Appreciate you guys watching. Hope you were as excited as I was. See you later.